We're so glad that you've decided to join us today as we continue this important discussion about website compliance. If you were on the call last week, you might remember that Bill mentioned over the past 6 months, we've seen a growing number of hotels being sued over alleged violations of the ADA related to website accessibility. So if this is happening to you, please reach out to WH&LA. We are here to help. But today we are so excited that we have Matt Bitzer to explain about website accessibility specifically for hotel websites. He's also going to share tools and resources to address compliance on your website. There's also going to be time for questions at the end, and Connie Barbian from Connect Hospitality Solutions is going to come on and do those questions with Matt. So if you have any questions, please pop them through the chat box on the side, and Connie will ask those toward the end. So Matt is the CEO and co-founder of Blue Magnet Interactive. It is an award-winning Chicago-based digital marketing agency servicing the hospitality industry. With over 15 years of experience working with major hotel brands, independent properties, management companies, and hotel owners, Matt has devoted his career to helping hoteliers monetize their property's online presence. Within the past few years, Matt has become the company's resident expert in website accessibility, providing guidance to hotels as they navigate these murky legal waters. So we're so excited to have Matt here today to share more about this. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, Monica. Appreciate that introduction. It was fantastic. And welcome, everybody. I'm glad to have you here today. I've got a lot of great information to cover. First of all, I want to thank Monica and Connie at Connect Hospitality for reaching out to me and for discussing ADA compliance for websites. I know how important this is for the hospitality industry. I know it's a hot topic for everybody out there. And you being a part of this presentation and sitting in on this webinar is the first step. Educating yourself on what's going on, what's required of you is an important first step. So I commend all of you for taking that, and I know you're going to get a lot out of today's information. So with that, my guess as to why you're here is that you've probably either experienced a lawsuit yourself, a discrimination lawsuit, or your hotel has had a demand letter sent, or you know somebody, a colleague, somebody in the industry that you know has experienced this. It's happening more and more frequently. Over the past 5 years, we've seen more of these happen. That's probably the impetus for you being here today. But you probably have a lot of questions, such as, why is there a bullseye on my back? How does the ADA even apply to websites? Maybe you understand how it applies to the physical property, but not necessarily for websites. There's a lot of information out there and a lot of ambiguity surrounding the law, but how do you separate the fact from the fiction? And what's your responsibility as a hotelier? What do you need to provide for your guests on your website? What does that look like? How much is it going to cost? And then who can actually help you address some of these things? So as Monica said, I'm Matt Bitzer. I'm the co-founder of Blue Magnet Interactive, and we're a digital marketing agency that's been helping the hospitality industry since 2007. We do this by helping hotels generate more revenue online. We do this through search engine optimization, social media marketing, email marketing, many different things. But one of those areas is website design and development. And this is where my expertise meets website accessibility, because if you're designing websites these days, we need to build them to be accessible. And so over the past 5 years, as hotels, as clients have started to become more aware of these types of lawsuits, they've been reaching out to get more information and guidance on how to proceed. And so we've really, Blue Magnet and myself in particular, has really become sort of a consultant for hotels on how to address these various areas of the ADA, specific to website accessibility. But I need to preface things in that I am not a lawyer, and this is not to be considered legal advice. A lot of the information I'm going to share to you has been provided by lawyers, has been verified by various experts. If you were on last week's webinar, you got to hear a great presentation by Chris Rivenberg, who is an ADA specialist. He's a lawyer. He actually writes his own personal blog about web accessible information. I highly recommend you visit his website and look at his information, but I personally am not a lawyer, so I can't speak to provide that specific legal advice. But these are my professional experiences, my professional opinions based on the years of research that we've done and the many hotels that we've helped to navigate these waters. I always advise anybody on these kind of calls to just consult with your legal counsel. Hopefully you have somebody in mind that specializes in ADA law, website accessibility law. But if you don't have somebody in mind, I do have a list at the end of this presentation that that provides a list of lawyers that can help with this kind of thing. So what are you going to get out of today's presentation? Well, there's a couple of things that we're going to talk about. One, I want to share with you what the ADA is and how it specifically applies to websites. There might be a little bit of a rehash on what was covered last week, but I know there's a lot of new folks on the call, so I will try to set that as a foundation for jumping into the next area. I also want to share with you some options for ADA website compliance. We'll talk about some steps that you can take to make sure that your website is fitted with website accessibility. And then at the very end, I have some tools and resources that you can use to help you address these things. We may not have time to go through all of them, but at the very end, you'll have this slide deck to take back with you to your teams, and you'll have all the links and phone numbers and lists of lawyers that you can contact on your own time. But I do provide those resources for you at the very end. So it's important to start at the very beginning and really understanding what the ADA is. And many of you have probably come up to this before. You worked in hotels, you understand what the ADA means for the physical property, but you may not know what the actual law says. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, really is there to prohibit discrimination against those with disabilities in all areas of public life. It's a civil rights law, and its purpose is to really make sure that disabled individuals have the same rights, same access, same opportunities as able-bodied individuals. And again, you're probably familiar with this on your physical properties. It's things like Braille signage for those who are blind. It's wheelchair accessible entrances, visual smoke alarms, phones compatible with hearing aids. These are probably familiar to you at some level, but how do you apply these types of ideas to your website? And that's what we're going to talk about today. The other thing to consider is how the ADA actually defines what a disability is. And they really have three definitions for this. The first is that it's a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of their major life activities. Second is a person who either has a history or a record of such impairment. And the third definition really opens the gates wide open, and it's considered a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. So you can see that this broad definition poses some challenges in how do we make our physical property, how do we make our website accessible when we have such a broad definition of disability to work with. There's many different types of disabilities. How do we tailor our website to address all these different variations? And it's probably for good reason. It's tough to name every single disability out there. So that's probably why the ADA does not specifically name every single disability that's covered, but it also highlights one of the major challenges. How can my website accommodate all these things if we don't even have a clear definition of what should be covered? Taking things a step further, if you look at what the EEOC defines as a disability, it includes things that you might not typically consider as fitting in that category. Things like cancer, diabetes, epilepsy, major depressive disorders, all fit within their definition. So it's very difficult to even categorize those properly in many cases. The CDC makes it a little bit easier in that they compartmentalize the different types of disabilities into 6 major categories, things ranging from mobility and cognition challenges to things like hearing disabilities and vision. Your website may not be as affected by something like somebody who has problems and difficulty dressing or bathing, self-care related issues, or maybe it's not going to affect their independent living, but your website is going to need to address people with mobility problems, people that aren't able to use a mouse, people with cognition difficulty, people that have trouble understanding and processing information, those who are hard of hearing or deaf, who aren't able to process audio cues, and those with vision difficulty who can't see proper contrast or in some cases can't see at all. How does your website address all of these different types of disabilities within the US? And it's an important thing to do. I know, like we said, many of you are probably here because you're faced with lawsuits, but we're talking about a huge section of the population on Earth that have these disabilities. In fact, 1 billion, according to the UN.org, 1 billion people suffer from some sort of disability, and it's actually considered the largest minority. So if you look at your website and you think about all the things that you do in your daily lives that revolve around the internet and navigating websites, if you can think about your website ostracizing one of the largest minorities in the world, it really starts to paint a different picture on why it's important to make your site accessible. If we look at just the US alone, about 25% of the US adult population lives with some kind of disability. So again, it's a significant portion of the population that's being underserved by these websites that are not made accessible. I had an entire timeline of the ADA that I was going to share with you to get into the background of how we got to where we are, but really the most important thing to highlight is that the ADA was signed into law back in 1990. This is before hotels even had websites for the most part. So you can understand why the law isn't quite as efficient at addressing all the technological advances we've had on the web over the past 30 years. We're kind of putting band-aids on solutions, and the law really hasn't caught up to define what it means to be fully accessible on the web. So take that little nugget with you. We're going to address it as we go through this presentation. So looking at the ADA, how does this apply to the hotel industry? How does the ADA apply to physical property and then also to the website? The ADA is really broken up into sections that address various areas of American life. These are called titles. So Title I deals with employment. Title II deals with how the ADA applies to state and local governments. And what's most pertinent to hotels is public accommodations, Title III. This is the title that hotels are bound by under the ADA. And the ADA specifically calls out hotels, places of lodgings, inns, motels, and motels as covered by the ADA. So as far as the physical property, there's no mincing words. It is clear that hotels obviously are bound by this law. But the question comes into play, is a website considered a public accommodation under this Title III? Clearly, the physical property is considered public accommodation, but is a website considered a public accommodation? And unfortunately, on this front, many courts across the US are mixed. Some circuit courts have said, yes, absolutely, a website can be considered a public accommodation. And this isn't just the hotel websites, this is businesses with a website. Some courts have said that, yes, it's a public accommodation. Other courts have said, no, unless your website is somehow integrated with your brick and mortar store, it's not considered liable under the ADA. And other courts have kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, you know what, there's not enough case law to really determine whether a website is a public accommodation, so we're just going to wait until there's more information, that we just don't have enough information to make that kind of call. But when it comes down to it, the fact that some of these courts have determined that a website is a public accommodation under Title III, and the Department of Justice has even come out and said that it is a public accommodation, means that hotels need to make sure that their website is compliant under Title III of the ADA. They are being held to it. Courts are seeing that this is something that they're being held to. So you need to make sure that your website is compliant. Unfortunately, until Congress and the Supreme Court make a final decision on this, it does leave this mess open to litigation. So that's why you're seeing a lot of lawsuits flying by. You're seeing a lot of these courts wrestle with these decisions. There is so much ambiguity that comes with this law right now because the Supreme Court and Congress have not formally weighed in to address websites in the ADA itself. And we can see how this has changed over time. Right here you see a quick graph of accessibility lawsuits for websites. This is data from 2019, dating all the way back to 2016. And you can see that in 2017 to 2018, there was a huge spike in cases. You went from 800 cases to about 2,300 cases in 2018. And this was due primarily to a lot of high profile cases, discrimination lawsuits, coming to the papers. It was just big news. You might have heard of Domino's and the gentleman, this disabled gentleman who was unable to order a pizza through Domino's Pizza's website. There was also a big case in 2018 where a shopper at the Winn-Dixie grocery store was unable to make a purchase there. These high-profile, big brand cases really just open the waters wide for other types of discrimination lawsuits to come about based on website accessibility. That's when we started seeing more. I mean, that's when Blue Magnet personally started seeing more and more lawsuits in the hospitality industry. It was about 2018, 2019, and that's when we started having more hotels come to us saying, why is this happening all of a sudden? Why is there this sudden surge? A lot of it is because of these high-profile cases that finally went to court and got a lot of publicity. So that's all great, but again, how does this apply to my website as a hotelier? And that's where we're going to talk about now. Before we talk about all that goes into making your site accessible, I think it's important to understand why you should make your website accessible. And avoiding lawsuits, while that may have brought you here today, that's not the only reason you should be considering. The first thing to think about is, again, there's 1 billion people across the globe that suffer from some sort of disability. How can we make our businesses, our websites, more conducive to their specific condition? It's the moral choice. It's a huge portion of the population that's underserved, and the goal is to not be discriminatory, to be inclusive, and to not be a jerk. By doing that, you're also making your site more visible. As we've said, millions of people in the US have some sort of disability. And so being able to present your website in a way that's accessible makes it visible to those people. Providing alternative text for your images or providing more information so that screen readers can properly parse the site opens your site up to a whole new population of people that your site may not have been open to before. It's about adding those kinds of elements that make your site visible to those who it was previously invisible to. Not only that, but making your site accessible supports an aging population. And as we know, a lot of the baby boomers are either retired or retiring, and that's a huge population that is now entering, some of them, into the disabled population. And that's due to vision impairment, in some cases mobility impairment. To give you a case, an example from my own experience, I'm actually down in Florida right now with my family, staying with my in-laws, and they have a new iPhone, and I can tell from the settings that they have that the text on their iPhone is set to the largest setting possible because they have difficulty seeing the small text on the screen. Designing your site to accommodate those kinds of users, many of who are doing a lot of traveling these days and who have a lot of savings to put towards their retirement, this is a population you want to serve. Not only that, but many of us will eventually, all of us will eventually enter that age where we're going to need assistive technologies, the ability to increase fonts. So designing for accessibility now not only benefits the aging population today, but future aging populations like ourselves. Accessibility is also good for just overall usability. When you design for disabled users, you also improve the usability for able-bodied users as well. And you understand this when you've gone to a website where you click a button and it doesn't do anything, or click a video and you can't close out of it, or audio starts on a website and you can't control that. Those are frustration points that we deal with often as able-bodied users. So making your site accessible for the disabled helps to improve overall conversion rates for all users, regardless of their walks of life. And usability goes hand in hand with SEO. For example, by adding alternative text to images to provide textual context for the blind when they're using screen readers to understand what image content is, that also provides extra SEO content for Google to better rank your site. Same thing goes for writing transcripts for videos. Those with vision impairments aren't able to see the video, so writing out that information so their screen reader can catch it provides extra fodder for the search engines. Google likes good usability. It's going to reward you for making those kinds of choices on your website. In the end, this all means more business for you. It doesn't seem like that now because it seems like you're being pressed for, with these lawsuits, but in the end, the move towards accessibility is better for business overall. It's good for the population. It's good for you personally as a hotelier. You cast a wider net over the people that you weren't previously catching before. And finally, if none of those are compelling at all, the bottom line is it's the law. The ADA says that you cannot discriminate, and that goes for your websites too. So make your website accessible for the disabled. However, when we go back to the ADA that was written in 1990, it still, to this day, 30 years later, does not mention websites at all. So again, we get back to the confusion surrounding how websites are to be treated. The DOJ has come out and said that the Americans with Disabilities Act does apply to websites and that it is considered a public accommodation under Title III. But the law itself provides no formal declaration of or definition of what the guidelines are. The ADA has basically come out and said you need to make and the DOJ has come out and said you need to make your website accessible, but we don't have a formal roadmap for how to get there or what that looks like. We have no guidelines. We just know it when we see it, which can obviously be incredibly frustrating for any hotel that's been served with a lawsuit because these guidelines don't exist in the law itself. There's just no definitive checklist. So we have a couple challenges. The law doesn't even mention websites. The ADA law doesn't mention websites. The Department of Justice won't define guidelines for how the ADA is supposed to interpret an accessible website. Disabled is pretty broadly defined by the ADA, and so you have to make sure that you're accommodating a wide range of disabled users. And there's also different requirements for different industries. In 2017, for example, the Department of Justice published additional guidelines specific for businesses like hotels that take reservations for disabled individuals. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that is a uniquely hotel feature that doesn't apply to the Winn-Dixie or the Domino's Pizza that I referenced earlier. That's a unique requirement for hotels. So as you can see, there's a lot of ambiguity that comes with this. And I think that's why there's a lot of confusion here, because if the courts can't make up their minds, if there's no standard guidance for this kind of thing, how can you possibly succeed? How can you make a compliant website when you don't have anything to go by? It's just one big gray area. So, how do we fix this? How do we deal with this ambiguity? Well, one thing that has come out of this is the WCAG. You may have heard it called WCAG or WCAG or many different names it can go by, but I'm going to refer to it as WCAG just for simplicity. But this really helps give formal definition to what it means to be an accessible website. It stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and that's exactly what it does. It provides very specific, tangible guidelines for how a website should comply with web accessibility in general. How can our content accommodate the disabled users? And these are the guidelines that we're going to use. So WCAG was created by an independent group, a global group called the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C for short. And their goal was really to provide a single shared set of global standards. And they don't just deal with web accessibility, they have other standards that they work on as well, but it's a global community of folks that have come together and said, we need some sort of unified definition for what it means for a website and its content to be accessible. And the purpose of this was just to make web content in general more accessible and to have some consistency in what that actually means. Now, the WCAG typically applies to more technical aspects of the site, although it can apply to the actual content that's written for the site. But things like structure, the way the site's coded, a lot of things on the back end of the site that maybe users, able-bodied users who are typically browsing, with a mouse may not necessarily encounter. But when you think about the WCAG, it's typically referring to more of the technical and usability standards within the site. And the important thing to note is that the WCAG is still not law. They're just guidelines. They're guidelines developed by this independent group of individuals. But short of the ADA actually defining this, the Department of Justice has come out saying, I guess these standards are really the best we've got. It's a good list of what we need to abide by. So when it comes down to determining in a court of law whether or not a website is accessible, let's just go ahead and use the WCAG. It's the best thing we've got at this point. And so that's how the DOJ has determined whether or not a website is accessible. Now, there's a few things to know in the way that this is presented. The first, usually it's written WCAG 2.1 AA or AAA. The version number is the number that follows WCAG, and that just tells you what version we're currently on. The first version was published in 1999, and by today's standards is quite outdated. It was replaced by 2.0 in 2008. 2.1 came out in 2018, and that's the most current standard. And we're set to have a new version of WCAG come out in this summer, but it remains to be seen. The important thing to note here is that starting with version 2.0, all additional versions are cumulative and built upon the very first 2.0 version. So if you've been compliant up to version 2.0 and version 2.5 comes out, then you only have to make sure your website is compliant with the new guidelines that were added between 2.0 and 2.5. So making your website accessible today just means that you have to add on the new accessibility guidelines as new versions come out. So this is a dynamic changing standard as the web evolves, as technology evolves. So it's something to keep in mind. The A's that follow this just determine the level of conformance. And there's level A, which is the easiest barrier to overcome, level AA, which is a more moderate, and AAA, which is the most difficult thing to implement on your website. And most websites can't even implement these. Sometimes it's just not possible to implement the level of conformance required by AAA. But most websites should accommodate both the A and AA requirement. This means removing, the A level is the very basic requirement. The AA is the removal of more significant barriers, things like text size and contrast. So this is how you would typically read this, this standard. So when it comes down to it, with today's standards, use WCAG 2.1 AA. That's what most courts use these days to look at whether or not a website is accessible. Does it comply with the guidelines proposed in this version and this level of conformance? And there's actually 50 individual success criteria, and I won't go into all that now. Last week, Chris Rivenberg provided some links to his blog post, I believe. And I encourage you to check that out. He actually has more of a layman's term on what these 50 success criteria mean for your website, specifically to WCAG 2.1 AA. Check those out. I'm not going to go through those all in the interest of time today, but I'll touch on a few of the items so you get an idea of what is expected in here. So all these standards are really organized into 4 basic principles. Is your website perceivable? Meaning, if you are an individual who's disabled, are you able to perceive the content of the website in some way? If you can't see the pictures, is there some other way that you can digest that information? Is there text that describes the pictures? Is it operable? Meaning, are you able to effectively navigate and manipulate the content on the site? If there's a movable slider, can you control that slider? If there's a video player, are you able to control that video player? Does the user have the ability to control that? Next principle is understandable. Is your content presented in a way that is not confusing, that the user can understand and easily consume? And finally, robust. Is your site built to withstand changes in technology? Is it built on certain standards that, is it built per web standards? Is it built the right way? Just like building a house has to be built to code, is your website built in a way that is generally approved by the W3C? Is it built to code? So the first of these principles, perceivable, this is a good example, a very simple one. Contrast of the text versus the background. The very top button has fantastic contrast, black and white, it's easy to see the text. The lower button is not going to be perceivable by somebody with poor vision or color blindness. The contrast just isn't strong enough. And so that particular element may be a crucial element, particularly if it's a book now button, that is not perceivable. And there's a very specific number, a contrast ratio that has to be achieved so that you can tell exactly, there's a quantifiable number that tells you, yes, this has enough contrast with the background in order to be perceived. It's just one example of the types of perceivable content. Another example is alternative text for images. So most of the folks that have the ability to see images can clearly see that this picture on the right is a picture of a hotel room with 2 beds and a TV on the left. It's very clear what that picture is. But if you don't have your vision, then you need to rely on a screen reader to tell you what that image is. And if you don't provide alternative text in the code, you have no idea what that is. So in this situation, if the image is guestroom.jpg, the alt text here says 2 large beds in a room with a view outside. That may be sufficient to give the blind user an idea of what that picture is about. If you don't have anything there, then all it knows is that there's a picture there. The screen reader simply knows there's a picture there, but can't communicate what that picture is about to the user. And that's a form of discrimination under the WCAG. The principle of being operable is an example here in the Temecula Creek Inn. They've got a beautiful website, but the very first thing you see on the homepage is a rotating slideshow of images. And unfortunately, you're not able to control the speed or whether or not that can progress to the next slide. It simply does that automatically. And that's actually not something you want under the WCAG. It's not accessible, particularly for people with cognitive disabilities or people who are easily confused with this kind of information. Being able to control those types of elements is an operable control that's important under the WCAG. For the understandable principle, that's things like tooltips. So for this example, you can see Facebook, the form for signing up for Facebook, gives you a little tooltip when you click on one of the cells. Clearly, first name and last name are the fields, but there's this little red box that says, what is your name? It's a very simple thing, but it provides context to those who have trouble deciphering what is required in those types of forms. Again, this is just one example of several of the criteria under the understandable principle. And finally, is your website robust? Meaning, was it built in a way that is standard code? You can check on the W3C site. I have a link further down in this presentation that allows you to validate whether your website actually has standard code here. And you can see in this example, again, I'm picking on the Temecula Creek Inn, they show quite a few errors. So those are things that by making your site standardized and addressing these kinds of errors, it's another barrier you eliminate to accessibility. But unfortunately, the WCAG is just one of several ADA compliance requirements for hotel websites. Again, it deals with the technical side of things, but there's some other considerations that I'll go into beyond just the technical side that should be considerations for you as you evaluate your own website. Additionally, while we're talking about just websites here, there's other digital content beyond just your website that should also be reviewed. And I'll touch on some of those items as well. But just because we're talking about whether the website applies doesn't mean that other digital content shouldn't also be accessible. We need to look at those items as well, and we will. So I think there's a lot of information that I'm tossing out at you, but I think it's important to step back and look at your website and look at your digital content and say, Matt, what are the 4 areas that I really need to focus on in order to determine my hotel's compliance with this law? And that's what we're going to talk about now. So when I break this down into its simplest components, I think there's really 4 things that we need to look at. One is the WCAG 2.1 AA. That standard is the benchmark for the code of your site, for the technical, the structural aspects of your site. How can users use your site and have it meet their needs? But there's also something that you need to consider because you are part of the hotel industry, and that is that 2017 law that specifically talks about how a booking engine should hold rooms and reserve rooms for the disabled, and we'll talk about that. There's also informational components. Has my website provided enough information, readable information on the site that allows me as a user to determine if that hotel can accommodate my needs? And it's important to be thorough in that as well. And finally, other content, PDFs, emails, videos. If you publish these on places other than your site or even on your website, they need to be compliant as well. It's not just the HTML or WordPress or Joomla sites that you have built. It's also this supplementary content that needs to be considered as well. So again, compliance checkpoint 1, WCAG 2.1. It's a lot clearer. There's a clear checklist that you can follow and check to see that your site is compliant. And how do you check this? There's a couple tools that you can use to do this. There's a do-it-yourself method, and tools such as Wave, Site Improve, and Axe all provide a free tool for reviewing your site page by page to determine whether or not it meets the WCAG guidelines. It's an automated tool. It just crawls through your site and it pinpoints these specific areas that you need to focus on. The challenge is that it only covers about 20 to 40% and catches 20 to 40% of actual errors on your site. For true addressing of these kinds of situations, you really need to do manual testing. And that's something that's probably beyond your own ability, your own in-house ability to do. Manual testing, disabled user testing, testing with assistive technologies like screen readers, all of that kind of work is typically done by professional agencies, website accessibility remediation companies like the one that our previous speaker, Chris Rivenberg, is from. He's from Essential Accessibility, and they provide a full-blown service for auditing a website from an automated standpoint. They do manual testing. They have a legal team on staff to help with demand letters and things like that. So they provide a full comprehensive solution. But if you just want to take a step back and really look at where your site stands today, the do-it-yourself options give a free option for you to be able to at least see where you stand today. But they're not going to be the full solution. You need to take it a step beyond that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Second compliance checkpoint, and my guess is that many of you are probably already doing this, but it's making sure that your booking engine complies with the ADA. And specifically, I'm talking about the 2017 updated guidelines that the Department of Justice published for the ADA that's specific to hotels. And there's a handful of different things that you need to make sure your booking engine does in order to comply with the law. The first thing is that you need to make sure that your site and your booking engine allows people with disabilities to make accessible room reservations. There should be a specific room type designated for your accessible room, and you should have information in there that specifically talks about that room type. You also need to make sure that you're describing the features of that guest room. You need to do so in enough detail so that if the user is making their booking, they can determine whether or not your hotel can accommodate their specific needs. Requirement 3 is that you hold accessible rooms for reservations by guests with disabilities until all standard rooms are sold. Requirement number 4, you can't overbook ADA rooms. It's prohibited under the ADA, so you need to remove an accessible room from inventory as soon as it has been reserved. Requirement number 5, if a disabled user books an accessible room, you need to make sure that you have that very same accessible room type reserved for them. So if they thought they were getting a roll-in shower, you better make sure that they are able to get that roll-in shower room once they get to your hotel. And finally, this applies to OTAs and other third-party booking sites. Wherever you are selling your rooms, make sure there is an accessible option there. Again, there's a lot of gray area that goes with this, particularly when it comes to the shared responsibility between OTAs and third parties. But if at all possible, if you have the ability to control these elements, you should, even if your content is hosted on sites outside of your own hotel website. The third compliance checkpoint is informational. So you want to make sure that you're providing enough information on your website so that disabled users understand how your business meets their needs. So these are things like creating an accessibility statement. And there's an accessibility statement generator that's even provided by the W3C that can help you get started. But you need to identify ADA features for the physical hotel rooms. Are there specific amenities, specific rooms? What are those features? Common areas, what are the ADA features for the common areas? Make sure that all pages also have a prominent link to the accessibility statement page, and then make sure that you identify features that may not fully comply with the ADA. So giving your users all this information gives them the ability to determine whether or not your business can meet their needs, and that's crucial to complying with the ADA. And it's often something that's missed when you talk about web standards and the WCAG. It doesn't specifically require those types of informational, contextual things, but it's essential that you provide those to your future hotel guests. And the final compliance checkpoint is other digital content. As I said, your website isn't the only thing that needs to be compliant. Things like your OTAs and third parties. You may not control the code on Expedia, but you control some of the content. If they give you the ability to add alt text, or give you the ability to add disabled or accessible room options, make sure that you are in there providing that information when at all possible. And again, this gets into a gray area, but you just want to make sure you're doing as much as possible so you're covering your bases. PDF and Word documents are another sore point for many hotels. I've been in the hotel industry long enough to know that hotels love putting new menus online every time there's a new promotion or special or Mother's Day brunch or Thanksgiving Day dinner. And unfortunately, many of those menus are just not compliant with the ADA. There's ways to create compliant documents, either starting with Microsoft Word, where many of these documents are started, or using Adobe Acrobat. You can go back and retroactively add accessibility options that are compliant with the WCAG, but I'll provide some of those in some of the future slides that you can take back to your teams, but that's another area that's often overlooked. People think, I need to make my website compliant, but having a PDF menu is fine, or having a PDF flyer or wedding package is fine. Those need to be compliant as well. Email marketing is another area that needs to be compliant. It's representing your business. You're probably using a third-party tool, but you need to make sure that things like color contrast, font sizes, setting the HTML language attribute that tells screen readers what language to read the content in, helps to give context to those with disabilities. So make sure your email provider offers these kinds of options. Video and audio is another important thing. If you're, some of the smaller properties may not have a lot of video and audio, but those bigger resorts, bigger box hotels may have their own YouTube channels or may have podcasts or more advanced audio and video. The key here is to make sure that you're providing captions, subtitles, even transcripts to these items. And not only does it help the disabled users, but as I said before, a lot of this information is going to help you perform better in search engines. A video that has been fully transcribed into text just provides more content for Google to parse and can actually help you in many areas of search engine optimization. And then of course, use accessible media players within your website. Give people the ability to control the media as it exists on your site. And then the same thing with mobile apps. Make sure that if you are a big box hotel, if you are a hotel with its own app, make sure that that complies with WCAG standards as well. And really, all of this comes down to risk management. I understand that a lot of these things cost a lot of money. Website remediation costs a lot, but it's a balance. How much do I invest today, and how much risk can I tolerate over the long run? I mean, honestly, it's expensive. When it's done right, it can cost anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 or more a year for accessibility as a service. Companies like Essential Accessibility that provide a full round of monitoring, manual testing, and all that. Unfortunately, it doesn't include actually fixing the site. So once a company goes through and audits this, it doesn't actually cover the developers having to go in and fix this. And additionally, it takes a long time. When it's done right, months of testing, months of site repair, it can take a while depending on how poorly your site fares with accessibility today. And there's other factors involving risk. How big is your company? How accessible is your website currently? And how strong is your legal team? All of these will determine how much risk you can tolerate. But really, the goal is maybe not to necessarily get 100% compliance, but to work towards perfection. As overall accessibility goes down, your risk of getting a lawsuit goes down as well. You're trying to make yourself not a target. So options for compliance. I think there's a couple areas that, couple directions you can go to really understand what your options are for compliance. And here we're going to talk about it. This is one I hadn't heard before, but last week Chris Rivenberg provided this in his. I thought it was interesting. Redirect your domain to Facebook. The cost is nothing. The risk is nothing. But I wouldn't recommend this because you're losing one of your most powerful assets, and that's your website. It's one of your powerful marketing machines, and to just redirect your entire website to Facebook certainly takes off the liability of on your shoulders, but it also removes a great part of your marketing engine. So I wouldn't recommend that. Installing overlays is another option that people have suggested. This really just puts a Band-Aid over this situation. The cost is low, but the risk is high. And in many cases, we've seen instances where hotels have become targets because those who are looking for these kind of drive-by lawsuits and easy targets look to sites that have these overlays and say, these guys probably don't have an accessible site. They're just covering it up with an overlay or a little widget. We're going to target them. It's not going to protect you. I'd recommend against that. Option 3 is to fix the existing website yourself through the do-it-yourself type. The cost is going to be lower. You're going to invest your time and probably a little bit of money into this, fixing the issues, but you're still going to have to pay a developer to fix anything you find. You could use some of the free tools like Site Improve or like Wave, but that's only going to get you 20 to 40% of the issues that are flagged for the WCAG. You're not going to be able to make your site fully compliant, most likely under the do-it-yourself method. Taking it a step further is hiring the pros to actually audit and overhaul your entire website. This is the most costly option, but it's going to reduce your risk significantly. So if you're the risk-averse type, making sure that you have a company in your pocket to handle all these kinds of things on your behalf is probably the most beneficial. The other option is you can just build an entirely new website, particularly if your website's a couple years old and you're looking to get a fresh coat of paint. Now's the time to start considering an ADA compliant website built from scratch. And you just need to make sure that you have a company that understands the ADA and developers who can build a compliant website to do this. It's low risk, but again, the cost is going to be high to make sure that your new website complies with those kinds of standards. With all that information, I wanted to give a bit of a walkthrough for where to go from here. Again, this is a lot of information to take in, but I have some actionable steps here that I think will be very helpful in navigating this. If you're a big box property, if you're a smaller bed and breakfast, or anywhere in between, these are things you can do right now to get started. So the first thing I recommend to everybody is getting strong legal counsel. Whether you need it now or whether you need it later, it's good to have somebody that knows the ADA. So talk with, and I provide a list of vetted ADA lawyer resources at the end of this presentation that you can take back with you. Look up one of those. They're going to be able to help you in a pinch. Step two, you should be able to ensure that your booking engine complies with the ADA. Those 6 different standards that I provided, that should be something that you're doing already. If not, you should be able to go back and check, and that's something that you can do on your own to make sure you comply. Step 3 is to just document all the physical ADA features in the hotel, making sure that you have a full list of common areas and guest rooms and what the physical ADA features are in that hotel, and we'll use that information later. You should also create an accessible rooms page or section that's separate or different from what your standard accommodations are. You offer a standard king room. Well, if you offer an accessible room, it's different from the standard king room. Explain what the differences are and what those rooms have that's different from the standard room. Make it easy for a disabled user to understand what those differences are so they can make an informed decision. Here's where our list of ADA features comes into play. You're going to want to put this information on your amenities page, accessible rooms page, your accessibility statement. And again, there's no formal guideline for where this needs to go. We're trying to cover our bases. So I can't go to you and say, once you put all this information on these pages, you're going to be covered, because there is no roadmap. It's a vast gray area. So we're doing what we can to provide information in what we feel is the right places in order for users, disabled users, to make an informed decision. You're also going to want to take inventory of your site and understand what content is subject to the ADA. The website is the obvious choice, but like I said, videos, PDFs, emails, all that has to be compliant in some way. So take inventory of what needs to be compliant so you can start chipping away at that. You're also going to want to define a standard. I'd suggest going with WCAG 2.1 AA. It's the most current version, and it's going to make sure that your website is compliant, at least until they come out with a new version, in which case you'll just need to add on some of these new guidelines that are coming out. You're going to want to publish an accessibility statement, so work with your lawyer to create that. You can put information in there on how to accommodate disabled guests, who can they contact with questions, and how to identify, identify what level of conformance your website has to the ADA. So explain what you've done on your website to actually address accessibility. And make sure that accessibility page is linked from every page. Put it in your main navigation or put it in your footer. Again, there's no requirement here, but this makes sure that anybody can access this page from anywhere in your site, and it's important to have. Step 10 is just for you to get an idea of how your website currently fares. Run an automated accessibility scan of your website using tools like Wave or Site Improve or Axe. It's just good for you to understand where your site currently falls so you can be better educated to bring others on board to help. You can also take that information derived from those reports to then provide to other developers to fix this low-hanging fruit. So if you work with a web development company, a lot of these things like alt text, text contrast ratio, heading structure, these should be some easy fixes and are typically the things that are targeted in these drive-by lawsuits, the ones that may not be legitimate. It's people using these automated tools to find some of these easy pickings. If you fix those, it's going to lower some of that liability. Now here's where it's decision-making time. You need to make a decision on whether or not you're going to invest further in accessibility or take the risk. Because hiring an accessibility expert is really the next step, and that's where you bring in companies like Usable.net, Essential Accessibility, and these are companies that can assess, perpetually monitor, and then remediate your site. They'll do automated reviews, manual reviews, disabled user testing. All this kind of information can then be provided to a developer, which you will then also need in order to actually perform the changes that they find on the site. Once the developer has that information, then they can go ahead into the website, make the changes, and ensure that whatever the accessibility company finds is actually put forth in your website. Now, unfortunately, you're not done. It's not a one-time effort. You need to train your team about accessibility. You need to then create content to be accessible. Websites, unlike your hotel, are living, breathing beings. Your hotels probably go through renovations every so often, but your website can be updated on a daily basis. So create new content to be accessible as you go, and then test and monitor that content once it's created. Make sure you're conducting annual audits to catch things that slip through the cracks. You're not going to catch everything as you create it, so the annual audits are there to pick up the slack. And then stay on top of the updated WCAG standards. As I said, the new version is likely to come out this summer, and you need to make sure that your website reflects those new ADA accessibility features. I know we're running short on time here. We can go through these really quickly. Otherwise, Monica, feel free to cut me off and we can jump into some Q&A. But some of these myths and misinformation are based on conversations I've had with hotels and some of the things that they've brought to my attention. Myth one, we've discussed this, overlays and plugins like youre and Accessibility are not good solutions. Don't use these, they're not gonna save you. Courts have ruled that you can't provide a separate but equal option on your website, and that's essentially what these tools do. You have to provide a better option than just slapping a plugin on your website. Myth number two, automated tools identify all accessibility errors. We talked about this. That's not true. They only catch about 20 to 40%. That's why companies that do manual testing and disabled user testing are crucial to getting the full 100% coverage. Making my website accessible is a one-time project. As we talked about, it's an ongoing effort. New changes to the WCAG are coming out. Regular audits are recommended. Your website changes regularly, so make sure that you are making that accessible as you go. Your physical property may be grandfathered into certain accessibility ADA laws, but websites must be accessible regardless. Your website cannot be grandfathered in any way. Once my website is 100% accessible, I'll never receive another ADA lawsuit. Unfortunately, you can be sued for any reason at any time. The goal here is to reduce your liability by making your site more accessible. So the more you can do and the more effort you can put towards this within your means, the better off you'll be. Most web developers create ADA compliant websites. Unfortunately, many website developers say they do this, but many of them don't have in-house accessibility teams. They may run automated tools like the Wave tool for assessing accessibility, but that's not going to ensure that your websites are fully compliant. Blue Magnet has served as a consultant, but even we don't have an in-house accessibility team. Hotels have come to us, we've reached out to partners, companies like Essential Accessibility to provide services beyond what we can provide in-house. And together we work through those challenges, but make sure whatever developer you partner with to build your website can provide that full scope of services. Otherwise, you're only getting part of the solution. My hotel can only be sued once. Not true. In 2019, of the 2,200 total sued, there were 21% of those that got sued a second time. So lightning can strike twice. It's too expensive to make my website accessible. You've probably heard this before, but it's more expensive not to. I know not every hotel has deep pockets, but do what you can to lower your liability. And finally, most accessibility lawsuits are frivolous. In the end, it doesn't matter. Whether they're frivolous or not, it's the law. And you're looking to be inclusive in your business and in your website. And by essentially discriminating against one of the largest minorities in the world, you're hurting your own business. You're hurting a large portion of the population that needs to be able to live and conduct business online. So make sure that your website accommodates them. Finally, I'm not going to go through this. This is more for an offline thing, but I have a bunch of resources to help. Automated evaluation tools. I have a list, contact information, links. Accessibility as a service. Companies that can provide the full soup to nuts review of your site. Some ADA law firms that you can reach out to for help if you've been in a situation where you need assistance or if you will need it in the future. Some web developers that can provide some of this remediation, as well as other resources, other sites, blogs, webinars, podcasts from many of these companies who have provided some great interviews with lawyers and other experts that really give shape to this. So I know we're short on time. I've exhausted my list here, but I hope that this has provided you with a good overview. It's a lot to cover in 45 minutes, but if you do need additional assistance, please reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any kind of questions or point you in the right direction. I've been doing it for years, and it's one of the things I enjoy about connecting with people. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Monica.
Thank you everyone for being here today. And thank you again, Matt. We really appreciate your contribution and your expertise. We will be linking up to this video with the resources on our website. So definitely check that out. It is wisconsinlodging.org/inittogether. Thanks so much and have a great day. Bye-bye.